so much for the opportunity to be here. And thank you again to interpreters for helping us communicate. I hope this contributes to a bit about a really much needed global conversation about what to do with these tech giants that we're living among and those vying to be the future tech giants. So the story I want to offer to you today begins artificially, like all story beginnings, in 2016, so a few years ago. I was at the time working more as a reporter. I'd been a journalist for about a decade, and the news started coming out that Twitter might be up for sale. The company behind the microblogging platform Twitter. And this really struck me because while working as a journalist, I'd come to really depend on Twitter. I first started using it heavily during the Arab Spring in 2011 as protests were breaking out across the Middle East. And I, at the time, wasn't able to go travel there, but I was covering those protests. I was running a news website about resistance movements around the world. And I needed to know as much as I could. And I came to really embrace Twitter as a tool for connecting with activists and journalists and others around the world engaged in a variety of movements. And the idea that this tool, which became so important to my work and really to my life, was also a commodity, something that could be bought or sold. Maybe they were talking about at the time, maybe Disney would buy it or Google. Just didn't seem right. And so I, at the time, wrote an article in the Guardian, a British newspaper, suggesting, hey, what if Twitter were owned by its users? You know, what if that feeling that I had of ownership, you know, of being a part of the Twitter universe, were actually expressed in how the company was owned? Now, I've written a lot of such articles that project kind of fantastical ideas like this, and usually they just kind of plunk in the water. But this time, actually, people around the world started organizing, started saying, okay, let's do it. I wasn't the only person who felt this way. And so first we did a kind of petition campaign, you know, writing a petition to Twitter, hey, consider user ownership. And then we realized, actually, we had some shares of Twitter stock in our community, and we could use those to make a shareholder proposal to the company itself, asking it to consider options for user ownership. We had this big battle with the Twitter Corporation where they tried to strike it down at the American Securities and Exchange Commission, and we won, and we got it before the company, and it got a 4% of the vote in early 2017, which is pretty not bad for like a crazy idea. It's enough to be able to resubmit. And we also got a lot of attention. A lot of articles, you know, in places like Wired magazine, major Silicon Valley type magazine, lots of others, Vanity Fair, saying, wow, what a crazy, radical, harebrained idea. That's kind of interesting. And then life went on. Now, in the story I'm going to tell you today, something weird keeps happening. Right at the moment where I think I have a really radical idea, the kinds of companies that I am used to thinking of as my enemies start taking that idea up. Now, at the time of this effort, you know, this didn't come out of nowhere. As many of you know here, you know, this institute has been part of this movement. We had been, a group of us, a network of us around the world, had been building a kind of movement, a community around this idea of platform cooperativism. The idea of building shared ownership into the online economy. Cooperatives are businesses that are owned by their participants rather than by outside shareholders, right, who are just in it for profit. They're owned by their workers or their customers or their the companies or small businesses that rely on them. And we were looking to this kind of model as an opportunity to build democracy into the online economy. This Twitter campaign was part of that movement, and it was because we had that community that the idea kind of took off. But still, this idea was among the people who were thinking of themselves often as radicals, who were thinking of a radical re-envisioning of the structure of the online economy. So then it came as a bit of a surprise to me when just last year in 2018, then into early 2019, several of the companies, again, that I had come to think of as my enemies, as representing the most kind of compromised of the so-called sharing economy, were filing letters to the Securities and Exchange Commission asking it to allow them to share ownership with their users, to distribute company stock among their users. Something very much along the lines, a modest step, but something in the direction of precisely what we've been calling for, building democracy into the businesses themselves, into how they're owned and governed. Even the Airbnb letter articulated a lot of the rationales that we'd been harping on in our little radical world for a few years. Now, I don't think they had a lot of the same rationales for this. They saw some self-interest here. But it made me realize that what if we could somehow meet in the middle? What if we could recognize that these companies seem to have some interest in economic democracy as a tool for their businesses and leverage that to create a new kind of paradigm, a kind of race to the top where companies might actually compete with each other, not just to extract more data from their users, to depress and suppress working conditions, to wipe away rights that workers have fought for generations, but instead to actually compete with each other to share ownership and economic alignment through democracy even more. And this kind of led me to a question about what if we had a new kind of story available to startup companies, especially working in the tech sector. Now, if anybody worked for a startup, a new company involved in the tech economy, a couple people, one maybe. So if you're a startup, there are generally two kinds of stories for what you aim for. Startups are companies, they're not just trying to be small businesses, they're really trying to take over the world. They're trying to be something big. And in order to do that, they take on lots of early investment. They get somebody to give them a lot of money early on so they can invest in building what they want to create. And in order to pay that investment back, they need an exit. An exit usually comes in two ways. One, you're acquired by a larger company. Tencent swoops in, sees that you're doing something cool, buys you up, and your investors get paid back. The founders get a big payday. A few people get fabulously rich, and those users, their data, is now the property of Tencent. The other option is an initial public offering. So you become publicly listed. You sell, rather than selling to a big company, you sell to a public market and people can trade your shares. In both cases, you're passing the company off, the thing that you've worked to build, off to new owners, new investors, whose job it is to trick future investors to overvalue the company, right? So it's the endless hamster wheel of the investor Ponzi scheme, right? The pyramid scheme of capitalism. What if there were another way? What if we were able to create an exit option that was designed for communities, where a successful company that builds a community successfully of users is able to exit to community ownership? Now, this is actually not so crazy. Again and again, I've started to see, both in history and in examples in the present, pathways for how to actually do this. And I've been working with a group of lawyers and investors and entrepreneurs around the world to try to create some pathways here to contribute to the kind of solution space for how to address some of the deep problems of the online economy. Now, this could have some real benefits. Unicorns are the Silicon Valley term for those big billion-dollar companies that take over the world. This could be a way of addressing some of the abuses that we often see with unicorns, building accountability into the structure of the companies themselves, creating shared benefit, enabling those companies to be better aligned with the interests of their users rather than being in the position of trying to extract as much as they possibly can from those users, getting away with as much as they think they can get away with. There's also this category in the Silicon Valley lexicon of zombies. These are the companies that don't quite become unicorns, but aren't failures, and they're just kind of dead weight on the investors' balance sheets. These are like good companies that actually have revenue and like have a base of users and have like good employees and are like trying to meet actual needs often. And yet, in the eyes of the Silicon Valley universe and of much of the global tech economy, these are worthless. They don't provide the kind of exit options that the investors need. So, what if we had a new kind? What if this exit to community strategy could enable these zombies to be cured of their condition? So in order to take you through some of the strategies that I've been exploring with my collaborators, I'm going to introduce you to a fake company called CoSocial. Now, in the US, when I do this talk, I have to paint the picture of a company that involves like both social media and personal data and a kind of transaction economy. But that should be easy here because you have WeChat. We have no such kind of tight integration, but that's basically what we're talking about here. So for strategy 1, the idea is for a financed buyout on behalf of users where investors get paid off and then the resulting ownership structure for the company is maybe a trust, an entity that holds shares on behalf of users. Okay? Now, this might sound a little nuts because you might think, oh, I'm a user of WeChat. Who here would like shell out money to co-buy WeChat with a billion people? Nobody. But that's okay. Oh, one person, great. That's okay because there are actually precedents. For instance, for employee stock ownership plans in the US and some other parts of the world, it's possible to finance that buyout without need for user capital, taking out loans and other financial instruments on the promise of future benefit. So you could actually create structures where this could happen without user cash going on the line, and then the funds go into a trust or cooperative that conducts the buyout, and then later on users see the benefits. So in this case, perhaps if people are doing trading money, running a gig economy on the platform, maybe a cut of that economy goes into gradually paying off this investment, and as users become vested as owners, they start to actually see dividends. They start to see revenue from their ownership. So this could take a few forms. One, it could take a form kind of like a good version of what Facebook is doing now, where it's using a trust to mediate with a semi-independent oversight board. So it could be really more about governance and making sure that users have an eye over the shoulder of the company, that they can monitor what's being done with their data. Really more about governance. Or it could be really more about revenue, like distributing value created by users' labor back to them. We've heard a little bit about that earlier today, about what if users were paid for their data? What if users saw the profits from the underpaid labor that they're contributing? So the purpose could look different in different contexts. And it turns out that actually something like this is being tried, right? Over in Shanghai, NIO, about a year ago, transferred 50 million shares into what they call a user trust for the purpose of enabling users to benefit financially from whatever success the company might eventually have. So this is a really interesting experiment in this kind of model. And again, it was led by the founder, looking for a way to align the interests of the company with the interests of its users. Now, a second strategy looks very different. In this one, CoSocial realizes it can't play the game of the big monopolies. It's not going to be the next WeChat or Facebook. The space is too crowded. But if it structured itself differently, it could create market share in a different way. It could create a deeper trust with a range of stakeholders. So in this way, imagine if WeChat became really co-owned by maybe the people who create what do they call them, micro applications, or the businesses that create apps within the ecosystem, right? And they were the ones who actually controlled, maybe they ran the software on their own servers, but then they share a common infrastructure. So WeChat's ownership is distributed out among its members, and maybe this might actually encourage members to encourage companies, organizations, communities of people to join because they know they have more freedom in that ecosystem. They have some power in it. This was actually what happened with the rise of the Visa credit card system. It was created initially by a big bank, Bank of America, and it was facing a revolt of the small banks using the product. And they realized the only way to make this credit card system work was to transfer the product to a cooperative of the smaller regional banks. That was the only way they could trust each other. And that gave rise to the modern credit card industry, by recognizing that distributing power from one company across an industry could solve some of the network coordination problems. We see similar patterns also in journalism around the world. Cooperative agencies like the Associated Press in the US, or similar entities in India and across Europe use this kind of model to share resources among competing news organizations. And this might happen voluntarily, as with Bank of America, or it might be something actually forced. Something we're discussing a lot in the US today is the idea that our tech companies have gotten too big and too powerful, and that maybe they should be broken up. This kind of strategy could be a way to carry that out without losing some of the positive benefits of shared protocols and platforms and network effects, while enabling smaller players and participants to have more say and more of a role in the ecosystem. And again, this is a very kind of clear and present conversation for us right now. It's something that is being discussed heavily in Europe, though the U.S. government is the one in our case that really has the power to change the structure of some of these companies. So this could be a tool, this cooperative structure, for rethinking the future of the tech monopolies. A third option uses some of that fancy blockchain stuff a few people have mentioned on and off. Here, pending lots of regulatory uncertainty, there's an opportunity for new technologies to enable shared ownership among users of the platform through tokens rather than through conventional stock. So for instance, what if that CoSocial app started using its own currency system, its own token system, to facilitate trades across borders and so forth, right? And it developed that token system into a programmable thing along the lines of like Ethereum, for those of you interested in blockchain stuff, where you could actually write contracts into the money as well as trade the money. And soon, maybe these tokens started to obtain such value that their collective market capitalization begins to exceed that of the company itself. And as holders of these tokens, users start to have a role in governing the network that this platform is attached to. Through this kind of system, users could help determine how money is created, could help determine the kinds of systems and products and governing mechanisms are available in the system. And you could end up with something that starts to overshadow the conventional company, where those shares start to matter less and those tokens start to matter more. Now this could, take a number of different forms. For those of you blockchain geeks, I'd love to compare notes about how some of these things could proceed. But the point is that we do shared ownership through the tokens rather than the stock, even if maybe one option is to actually represent the stock as backing the token economy. Now, once again, right when I think I have a crazy radical idea that will undermine the power of the big enemy giants, one of them comes along and does the evil version of what I've been proposing. And so you might have seen that over the last year, Facebook has been proposing this new token system called Libra, a global payment system that would be separate from the company, but would be attached to certain products that it's producing, and governed actually by a consortium of financial and tech companies, as well as nonprofit organizations that have a part to play in the economy. Now, a lot of those are no longer part of the system. The regulatory concerns about some of the choices that they made about how to structure and support this currency, have gotten them into some trouble. It's not clear what's going to become of this proposal. But nevertheless, it's interesting to see a large company like this seeing an opportunity for itself, not in controlling a new token system entirely, but actually in distributing control and extending its power through a network that is independent of the corporation strictly. Now, I've talked about examples here, largely from the stable of the big bad tech companies. But actually, this kind of strategy might matter more for the kinds of tech companies that we haven't seen yet. Right now, I think we're tapping such a tiny section of the opportunity that we have in the startup ecosystem. I've been working with a group called Zebras Unite, which is a network, an international network of founders, startup founders, who are largely women and people from underrepresented ethnic groups in the startup economy, recognizing that, for instance, in Silicon Valley, you have along the lines of 90% of investors being white males, and a comparable number of investees, sharing those same attributes. This clearly does not map onto the potential for innovation and entrepreneurship. And the Zebras community claims it's not just a matter of representation. We actually need different kinds of models, because we're trying to build companies that are really focused on our communities. We're trying to solve problems in our communities. We're not just trying to blow up the world. And in order to do that, the venture capital channel from seed stage to exit to the investor hamster wheel just doesn't cut it. So these kinds of models might, more than anything, unlock new kinds of startups, startups that focus on building their communities before focusing on extracting from them. So this is not something that can happen overnight. You know, as I've mentioned, there are a number of projects that are kind of interested in this. There are a number of startups that would love to have this kind of trajectory. But it's not as easy to do for many of them as it might be to go into the conventional system. You know, building a startup is hard enough. Building a whole system while building a startup is nearly impossible. So there are a bunch of challenges that I would say there are a bunch of broken pieces of the current tech economy that we need to consider. One is clarity around liability. This is for financing, really. How do you finance a bunch of people all together? It's kind of easy to finance a fairly tightly owned startup, you know, that's largely owned by one person often or a small group of people, because then you know who's in trouble if things don't work out. But we need structures like maybe trusts or certain kinds of cooperatives or other collective entities. And we need the regulatory infrastructure so that those can be financed, so that they can get money in order to conduct buyouts of the platforms they participate in. This might also mean tax incentives. Certainly in our system, there are a lot of tax incentives that people don't even see or notice that really privilege the ownership of large corporations by small numbers of people, where it's a lot easier to be a capitalist if you're already rich. You know, it's a lot harder to become a co-owner of something that you participate in if you're not, just because of how tax law is structured, and we need to change that. You know, there's a third option might be something that Elizabeth Warren, one of our presidential candidates right now, is proposing, which is that maybe companies over a certain size need to, if they're going to grow that big, become more internally democratic. To say that, okay, if you're going to, you know, be a multi-billion-dollar company, maybe you just have to have some worker or user representation on your board, some worker or user ownership. So make it so, you know, one of the consequences of becoming a big company is practicing meaningful democracy. You know, one final thing that I think is especially interesting here and especially challenging is the opportunity for cross-border regulation. You know, right now, a lot of the regulatory conversations for tech companies are based on meat-space jurisdictions, right? They're based on national powers that have jurisdiction over the corporate law in each case. But building governance into the companies themselves creates opportunities for people like you and me to start to talk to each other more about how we'd like our platforms governed, to turn platform governance into much more of a transnational experience. So this right now requires a lot of pioneers. It requires people willing to experiment. And all of these types of people have started to join this conversation. That includes firms that see value in community, that want to prioritize their business models around serving certain communities. This means entrepreneurs who are not only willing to try to build something new, but actually want to build something new in a new way. And luckily, we've got more and more people interested in doing just that, you know, who recognize that this kind of model is aligned with their goals. And it also requires social movements, we find. You know, we've got some really good allies in labor and in the tech kind of advocacy space, you know, who recognize the value, long-term value for their movements in this kind of work. And there's so much still to be done. I've been working lately on you know, research papers that explore some of the legal dimensions of these strategies. We need to identify, if you're a startup trying to exit to community, what are the things you can and can't do? What are your limits? And what kinds of precise policy prerequisites do we need to ensure that this kind of option is available in as many parts of the world as possible. But I guess for now, I'll just leave the question to you. Do you want to try? And if you do, I would love to hear from you. My lab at the University of Colorado, the Media Enterprise Design Lab, is working on building some of the infrastructure for this kind of model. And we're holding webinars and other things that enable people from anywhere to participate. And we'd love to work with you. So I'd like to also acknowledge, again, the collaborators who have been really invaluable to me in making this kind of work possible. And thank you for taking the time to humor me.